Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's lecture. I am here in front of the Imperial Throne in the Forbidden City in Beijing. And today we're going to be looking at China and Japan during the early modern period. So, in today's lecture, we're going to be going over three things. We're going to be going over the um, Ming era Chinese dynasty. Um, Look at the way that they rebounded from the rule of the Mongols. We look at the Qing era, how they became one of the more powerful forces in the East before shutting down and closing themselves off. And then we're going to be looking at Japan and how Japan moved from um, a very closed structure and began to open up a little to the west before closing itself right back off again. So just like we see in the Middle East, we're going to be seeing a natural natural hindrance to European um, ascension actually close itself off and allow Europe to once again continue to move throughout the world. So I hear people coming in, so I'll go ahead and get started with the lecture. So we'll go ahead and get started here looking at Asia in the early modern era. And today's lecture will be divided into three parts, as it's usually been. First, we'll look at the Ming Dynasty in China, then we'll look at the Qing Dynasty, and then finally we'll move into the Tokugawa Shogunate in Japan. So the first thing we're going to be looking at is China under the Ming Dynasty. And it is under the Ming Dynasty that you see a lot of changes happening to China. For about a century, you've had the Mongols ruling over China and sort of creating a mass of chaos in the empire. And it's under the Ming that you see all of this really change substantially. Now, just like we did with Africa, we're going to go ahead and look at the geographic differences between areas in China to kind of see how um, Chinese culture develops based on this geography. Um, China has more landmass than the U.S., but it is um, very similar lines of latitude to the U.S. So you see a lot of wide varieties of lands, just like you do in the United States. You have a desert up top. You have mountain ranges. You have plains and plateaus towards the south. You have the Himalayas down at the bottom, and then you have a nice temperate zone towards the Pacific Ocean in the South China Sea. Excuse me. But like the United States, the land of China is traditionally divided into North and South China, and just like the Americas, just like the United States, um, North and South are kind of seen as an industrial North and a more a rural South, a more agrarian South, and a more backward South. So just like in the United States, the North are seen as more civilized, and the South are seen as a little bit more backwards. North China is dominated by the Yellow River. You hear the Huanghe, and this Yellow River is the source of life for China's imperial dynasties and their imperial society. So the Yellow River is the Nile or Tigris and Euphrates to Chinese culture and Chinese society. Uh, because of how north it is, however, you have a lot harsher climates in the north of China than you do in the south. And the Yellow River is dominated by a flood and drought cycle that is similar to the ones of Mesopotamia. So it's a very rough climate. It is a very finicky river, and there's a flood and drought cycle that ebbs and flows throughout the centuries. So North China, because of all of this, has this grand imperial dynastic system that builds up giant cities, walled cities. The Great Wall of China is up in the north as well, and so you have a sense of an older culture, a sense of superior culture in the north. South China, however, is separated from the north by the Singling Mountains, and you have the Yangtze and the Sea rivers dominating, and because of this, you have a lot more floodplains and a lot more chances to settle down and live by a much calmer river base, and you have much milder climate as you go down towards the South China Sea, towards the Pacific Ocean. So, because of this, South China's traditional rural land. It's got smaller cities. It traditionally had a lot of smaller villages, and it was seen as a backwards place, as a place with country bumpkins. They didn't need to create these great walled cities until much later than the North did. They didn't need to come together to form great societies and empires in the South, and so they didn't. And because of this, the South is sort of seen as being needed to be brought up, and that's what you've seen in the 20th century China, is the South being quickly industrialized and quickly changed to try to create a solid Chinese culture and a Chinese society. So North and South are very different from one another, and North China is actually what dominates um, Chinese history and Chinese culture throughout the centuries. And it is because of this dominance that South China sort of never really develops on its own. It's always at the mercy of the North, and it's always at the mercy of what happens to the North. And in the 13th century, what happens in the North is that you have the invasion from the Mongols. And the Mongols have ruled China since 1271 under what is known as the Yuan dynasty. And basically, what the Yuan dynasty is the Mongols came in, the Mongols began to destroy cities, they began to burn fields, uh, basically behave as Mongols do. And so, pretty quickly, Genghis Khan moved on and later dies, but his grandson Kublai Khan decides to create a power base in China. And under Kublai Khan and his descendants, they begin to adapt more to Chinese culture than they had before. The Mongols begin to become more like Chinese. They begin to marry into Chinese nobility. They begin to adapt Chinese dress and Chinese culture, and you start seeing this dynasty become less nomadic and begin to set up and start rebuilding some of the cities slowly. However, but with the death of Kublai Khan and subsequent poor leaders, you start seeing infighting among the Mongols, and you start seeing Mongol power actually waning in Yuan China. You start seeing a lot of infighting among the tribes, a lot of infighting among the Mongol warlords and tribal leaders. At the same time, you get a lot of natural disasters that hit China in the early 1300s. So you start seeing the poor planning of the Mongols really in action, as the Mongols aren't really good about storing grain and planning for the future. As the natural disasters hit, the Mongols begin to look out for themselves and begin to hoard food, begin to hoard um, money, and basically start taking and raiding more villages as they begin to lose some of their foods, but because of the natural disasters. So the Mongols are going back and beginning to go back to their old nomadic terrorist ways, and this leads to a lot of rebellion. The most notable rebels are the Red Turbans. The Red Turbans eh, are basically independent cells of rebels that their only identifying feature is a red turban or sash that they wear over their hair, and attack Mongols and try to assassinate Mongol leaders or fight against Mongols. Usually, it's in cities or out isolated, and you have basically hit and run tactics, guerrilla tactics, reminiscent of a lot of these secret societies that have come before it, where you try to blend in with the people and strike quickly and then run away. Now, one of the things about rebels and rebellions that you need to note is that without a central unifying figure, you have are various factions fighting against the central government and basically being nuisances to government, but never really being able to cause enough disruption to lead to overthrow. And this is happening to the Red Turbans at this time. They have a lot of different factions that are striking at the Mongols, but not enough to really threaten the power base of the Mongols. You need to have a central unifying figure, but luckily for the Red Turbans, you have the rise of a leader of the rebels, a man named Zhu Yuanzhang, and Zhu Wanzhang is a poor farmer. As um, as he grew up, he lived in a farm with his family, and the story goes that um, Zhu Yuanzhang was out working in the fields, and his family was back in the farmhouse. And as it so happened, a group of Mongols rode into the village, and then rode into the farm, and they demanded money from Zhu's family, and Zhu's family had nothing to give them, and so the Mongols went about killing everyone and burning down the uh, burning down the farm, and then Zhu comes back in the evening, and finds everything in flames and his family murdered, and he is left an orphan. And so he goes, and as an orphan, he finds a Buddhist monastery and begins to learn to be a Buddhist monk, learning learning history, fighting, um, politics, everything that he can learn. And one day he goes out to meditate, and as he's out meditating, a group of Mongols comes to the temple, and the Mongols demand a tribute from the monks, but the monks have nothing to give them or refuse to give them anything, and so the Mongols begin and um, burn the temple to the ground and kill everyone there. And Zhu Yongzhang comes back and finds that everyone is dead, and that his all of his at least adopted brothers have been killed, and the Mongols have rode away. And so he the um, joins the Red Turbans and begins to bring different factions of the Turbans together. He's a great, if uneducated mind. He doesn't have the formal education of a Chinese aristocrat, but he, as a Buddhist monk, read as much as he could and learned as much as he could. And it turns out that he's really good at strategy and really good at fighting. And so he begins to train the Red Turbans to be a much more disciplined fighting force, a much more traditional fighting force. And he gets the and using tactics, using um, diplomacy of getting people that would otherwise have turned away from the Red Turbans. He gets them on his side basically by saying, help us and we'll get rid of the Mongols and we'll restore China to its glory. he gets people to join aboard with him, and the Red Turbans begin to they begin to become more of a legitimate fighting force, and they begin to take it to the Mongols openly with open warfare as a much more traditional warfare. And so Zhu Yuanzhang is able to gather enough allies and enough fighters to actually defeat the Mongols, defeat the Yuan dynasty, and he proclaims himself Emperor Hung Wu, which means bounteous warrior. And as the new emperor, Hung Wu, he's actually only the second commoner to become emperor. This has happened once before, hundreds of years before this, but Zhu Yongzhang, starting out as a poor farmer, poor monk, rising through the ranks of the rebellion, and then defeating the Mongols to become the new emperor is quite a feat, and it's happened once before in all of these thousands of years of Chinese history. And so, as the new emperor, Hong Wu continues to take the fight to the Mongols instead of allowing the Mongols to regroup, refocus, and come back in. He decides to continue his march to go all the way into Mongolia, and he makes it to the Mongol capital of Karakorum, and he burns it completely to the ground. Right now, it is a World Heritage Site, and it is basically ruins out in the middle of a pasture. It used to be a fantastic city that was a a pilgrimage site for Mongols. They would come and camp, and most of the riders would come in and just set up camps in the outer surrounding areas outside of Karakorum or inside Karakorum if you were a high enough ranking tribal leader. And but within the city there were people that lived there year round that basically were there to work in the temple or to feed and sell things to riders as they came in. But all of this was completely burned to the ground and destroyed. Hung Wu has his revenge for his family and for his brothers, and then basically after this, he continues to march uh, westward and actually makes it into Russia, and faces against Russian forces, and he defeats the Russians and is going to continue to move forward into Russia, but instead he sees that his army is pretty tired of fighting. You have a army that's pretty spread thin. He knows that he needs to get back to China and begin to create a brand new government, to start staffing a brand new government and everything. And so instead of continuing into Russia, he sets up a non-aggression pact with the Russian with the Russian Tsar, and basically by this point now the Chinese are the dominant force in the region, and they have no real enemies. And so because of this, you in 1368 you have the beginning of this new Ming dynasty, and Emperor Hung Wu begins to set up his government and begins to reform society and culture as a whole. He rules for 30 years, but then dies in 1398, and he's succeeded by his son Zhang Wen. Zhang Wen is not a great leader, and so you have, after his ascension, you have a civil war for succession, and it ends up being that the Prince of Yen, Zhu Di, ends up winning and becoming the new Yongle Emperor based on his military tactics and the strength of his admirals and generals. So with the rise of the Yongle Emperor, you have the Ming begin to look outward. For 30 years under Hongwu, the Ming had mainly focused in on China itself. They had they had begun to reform a society that had suffered under 100 years of rule by the Mongols, and so Hongwu couldn't really expand his territory as much as he wanted to, but now with this new focus, Zhu Di, or the Yongle Emperor, um, begins to look outward, and so this begins the dominance of the Ming. They quickly set out a path of exploration and conquest. The Ming are really they are ready to show their strength to the world. They are ready to show that China is a major player in world affairs. That China is not going to play second fiddle to anybody in Asia, or really anyone in the world. And so they begin to travel outward throughout the Indian Ocean, and they begin to travel outward pretty quickly after the ascension of the Yongle Emperor. He takes power in 1398, 1399, and by 1405, you're going to start seeing um, Chinese ships traveling through the Indian Ocean, South China Sea, and Pacific Ocean. So between 1405 and 1433, you are starting to see a lot of Chinese ships in the Indian Ocean, and this is the very first Europeans that begin to travel out into Africa is around 1430, and then they don't make it to the Indian Ocean until the late 1400s. So you have a good 100 year head start by the Ming into the Indian Ocean. And these are some of the people that the Europeans, the Portuguese, especially, and Spanish, are going to have to negotiate with, have to deal with going into Southeast Asia to try to trade for spices. And this is why Columbus is so eager to go westward to get around the blockades of things like the Ming ships. And the Ming really set a tone for their dominance. I see at sea by their large ships. They have these gigantic, um, uh, basically warships going through and being used as trade ships. These are ships that are meant to show power. They're meant to show strength, but they're not meant to colonize. The beginning of the Ming voyages um, outside of into the Indian Ocean, into Southeast Asia, are not ships of colonization. They're not setting up ports anywhere. These are treasure voyages. These are meant to gain wealth for the empire. They are meant to enrich the Ming. And so, because they are meant for wealth and for enrichment, they have to be very well coordinated, and they have to be very well managed. And someone that the emperor trusts, the Yongle Emperor trusts implicitly, is his admiral, who will be put in charge of these treasure voyages. That man being Zhang He. And Zhang He is a very important historical figure in Chinese history. He is known as probably the greatest admiral in Chinese history, and probably one of the greatest admirals in world history. Zhang He's rise to power is almost as uh, as unlikely as Hung Wu's was. So Zhang He had three strikes against him going into life in the Ming Dynasty. For starters, he was actually a descendant of the Mongols. He was a Muslim of the Hui people that quickly became Muslim uh, they were Mongols that quickly became Muslim and stayed around northwest West China. And then third of all, so he was a descendant of Mongols, a Muslim, and third of all, he was a eunuch. Um, and the reason he was a eunuch was the fact that he was captured as a slave when he was around 10 to 15 years old, and he was castrated in order to get rid of some of his temper and uh, um, some of his feistiness, I guess, for lack of a better term. He always tried to run away, or he tried to fight against his masters, or or against the slavers. And so he was castrated in order to get rid of this. And it never actually worked. He was still um, a pretty wild teen, and he really was someone that did not listen to or follow instructions as you would imagine a castrated slave would. And so eventually he enters the service of the Yongle Emperor back before he is the Yongle Emperor, when he's just Zhu Di, the Prince of Yen. And under Zhu Di, Zhu Di actually uh, brings him into his as a servant, as a slave. Actually, likes the fact that this young man is willing to speak up and speak out, and he actually begins to listen to him, to listen to his advice. And it turns out that Zhang He is a great naval strategist, and because of this, he's able to help the Yongle Emperor defeat his enemies during the Wars of Succession, and upon Zhu Di's rise to become the Yongle Emperor, Zhang He is made admiral, and he is going to go out on these great naval voyages, be the center point of these great naval voyages. And Zhang He is one of the greatest heroes in Chinese history. He dies in 1435 after an illness, coming back from one of his voyages, and he's buried at sea, as is the wish of most sailors. If they die in the ocean, they don't want to be buried on land. You get buried at sea. And so he dies in 1435. And in 1985, uh, during the height of the Cold War, during the height of Chinese communist aggression towards the West and towards anything non-Chinese, a tomb and a park are built for Zhang He. And here is that park that's built for him. Zhang He, since he was buried at sea, he did not receive a proper burial. And so during the ceremony here, they built a tomb for him. And this tomb here actually points towards Mecca and is covered with passages from the Quran in Chinese. So it kind of shows how much reverence the people in the government have for Zhang He, because this is communist China that has no real use for religion and actually bans religion. And for them to build a Muslim tomb, go through with a Muslim burial, and actually have it pointing towards Mecca, just shows the amount of respect that they have for Zhang He. Well, what did Zhang He actually do? Well, Zhang He set about through 7 voyages along the Indian Ocean down to Africa and into Southeast Asia. And like I said, these voyages were not about colonization. They were not about exploration. These were ships. These were voyages that were meant to show China's strength and to show that the Ming were now in charge, and the Ming were were a force to be reckoned with. And along his 7 voyages, he would take with him over 300 ships. And on these 300 ships, he had a crew of over 27,000 sailors. So this was a huge show of force. And along and among those 27,000 sailors on 300 ships, he had a main fleet of a few dozen treasure ships. And these treasure ships were meant to get as much resources or as much goods as he could from the people that he met along the way. And these boats were over 400 feet long. So here is a picture of one of his treasure ships next to the Santa Maria, which is Columbus's biggest ship. Columbus's biggest ship was less than 100 feet long, while the treasure ships were 4 times as big and probably about 5 times as tall. So these were massive ships. These were floating cities going through the Indian and Pacific Ocean. And as I said, these were not voyages of discovery or exploration. They were using old known trade routes. These are we'll go over this more in class, but these were routes that were known to Chinese sailors for hundreds of years. This was a show of military strength, and oftentimes foreign rulers would return with Zhang He. They would return with him to come and kowtow to the emperor. They would basically come and uh, they would basically imagine being a on an island in Southeast Asia or off the coast of India and seeing these giant ships make it to your shore, and then the person that's in charge of these ships says, well, there's someone that's in charge of me. And so they would go and they would offer their fealty to the emperor and bring him lots of gifts. They would go back with Zhang He on these fantastic treasure ships, and many of them would stay for a few years in China and then come back to where they came from. And so, one of the things about these voyages is that Zhang He actually makes it to the tip of Africa, or his voyages do, but pretty much as he's around Africa, the Yongle emperor has passed away, and a couple of new emperors have fought for dominance, and the Hangxi emperor actually doesn't trust Zhang He, much like Alfonso de Albuquerque. There are people that are uh, that are wary of his strength and how far away he's getting from China, and so they recall him back, um, and he has to go back in and doesn't really um, get to make it all the way around Africa like he wanted to. There's one last trip commissioned by the Zhuangdi Emperor in 1430, and that lasts for 3 years. And as he's coming back, he's asked again to come back in 1435, and that's when he dies at sea. So he never really makes it as much as he could. There is a legend of a Chinese ship that made it around Africa in 1420. That during one of the voyages was blown over off course and made it over past Africa, and was actually going towards South America, but decided to turn back around, not knowing what was out there. Didn't think that they had enough supplies to make it all the way, and so this was one situation where you can imagine what would have happened here if the Chinese had continued to go around um, the Cape of Africa, or gone even further west into South America. Another one of those what ifs of history, along with the Ottomans making it to North America, the Chinese making it into South America in 1420, a full 70 years before Columbus, and probably also spreading disease and sickness inadvertently um, to the people of the Americas. Two generations before Columbus came over. Imagine how different the world would be with that. But getting back to the Ming Dynasty and the things that they actually did do. So one of the things that we've been talking about is how this is the age of exploration and conquest. And even though the Ming government did begin to travel through the Indian Ocean, they did not seek to colonize. They were not looking for exploration or conquest. They were looking for economic conquest, definitely, because of these treasure voyages. But even though even though the Ming had several decades ahead of the Europeans and could have begun to conquer, they did not do so. And part of that was the fact that they were still rebuilding from the Mongol rule. Now, you do have an interesting issue that ends up popping up in the Ming Dynasty is this issue with eunuchs and the fact that eunuchs began to move up in power and in influence. And part of the thing with eunuch is that they were outside of Chinese bureaucracy. They were outside of Chinese society. Eunuchs were outside of traditional Confucian hierarchy because they could not have children and therefore could not participate in the in society as a whole, and so they basically operated outside and end up getting too much power into them and um, they begin to become corrupt and spread corruption throughout the government. So you had those issues begin to pop up with eunuchs. You also had a lot of major public works projects during the Ming Dynasty, such as the Forbidden City. The Forbidden City being the administrative and legislative head of the government, and this is where the emperor lived with his counselors, also living around there, and other leaders of and nobles would live in there as well. And inside, the further you got into the Forbidden City, the less people were allowed into it until you finally got to the palace, where only the emperor and a select few would be able to uh, be able to go inside. There was also a rebuilding of the Great Wall after the Mongols had come in. They You had uh, the wall go into disrepair, and so the Ming had to uh, rebuild the wall and strengthen the wall. And most of what we know of the Great Wall actually comes from this time period, since a lot of it was destroyed. And so you have money also being poured out that way. Uh, Corruption begins to grow, and then the military begins to become very expensive to maintain, and you start seeing poor leadership among the military, and a cycle of mismanagement begins to prop up again in the Ming dynasty. So as far as society goes, you had a huge population growth during the time of the Ming. During the Yuan dynasty, with the Mongols in charge, there was no huge rush of city living or a boom of population, because that's not what the Mongols were about. They hated cities. After decades of Mongol rule, you had a decline in populations, and then after the Mongols come in, you have this huge swell of urban populations, and a lot of this was because of those public work projects. Not only the Forbidden City and the Wall, but also irrigation, mass irrigation, and the beginnings of industrial capacity. And so the public works projects help bring people in to the cities from rural areas, and so the economy booms, and society begins to um, begins to grow, you have, because the Ming weren't out to conquer or to settle, that all that was taken over by by the Portuguese, Spanish, and later Dutch, and so the Chinese would eventually begin to trade with the Spanish and Portuguese, and you would have Chinese junks going throughout the Indian Ocean, trading and uh, basically being a part of this new global economy where you could find silver from the Americas in China, and you would find Chinese goods all throughout the globe as they began um, to expand, and as the Europeans began to move into the Americas, you have the continual renewal of trade between China and the Middle East, and that leads to trade between China and the Europeans, and then you have this huge network of global trade. Um, Education is a key to Ming culture. Part of this is the fact that during the Yuan, the Mongol rule, you had a de-emphasis in education, a de-emphasis in learning. And so getting back into a Confucian culture, the Ming would bring back schools, bring back universities, and bring back the exam systems in education. Not just in education, you also had a going back into and rediscovering arts and culture. You had the booming of artwork and theater, textiles and pottery. One of the things that we're going to talk about is Ming pottery and Ming, especially things like Ming vases. So you're looking at a sort of a Renaissance period for the um, Ming, especially from 1368 to the um, uh, end of the treasure voyages in 1430. So that's a good 70 years of dominance uh, and growth for the society. Unfortunately, 1435 is only the beginning of the dynasty, and you really see the Ming sort of um, beginning to fall into this bad pattern that you have in Chinese society of becoming the corrupt and overinflated government that you just rebelled against, and that happens quickly with the Ming, and so they are never really able to explore and expand. And instead, they allow the West to do that. And speaking of the West, the first people that make contact with the Ming are the Portuguese. The Portuguese are permitted to occupy Macau here in southern China. You have this uh, small port that is a Portuguese uh, port, and the Chinese allow them to occupy it, to take over, and use them uh, as a sort of a launching point for trade. Christian missionaries are permitted to reside in China. Portuguese and later Spanish missionaries are the first, and actually the Ming grow to detest the Portuguese. Um, because of their fervent Christianity and their continued proselytizing, even though they asked them not to. However, European inventions do impress Chinese officials, especially the improvement of firearms by the West, and then Christian missionaries begin to be impressed by the exam system of the Chinese and begin to take that back to Europe and adopt that. Um, Eventually, however, the Ming are going to be brought down to earth as well. You have crop yields decline due to harsh weather, epidemic sparks a peasant revolt, and the Dutch come in and take Taiwan completely. And so the Ming, like I said, they become what the Yuan were before them, sort of this bloated, inflated. Uh, Force that is hated by the people, and not only do you have internal strife, but now you have the ever growing presence of the West into China, and you have the pretty much the downward slope from about 1500 to 1640 is this huge downward slope of the Ming. So really, you have a good 70 years of prosperity, and then about 100 years of stagnation, and then a uh, uh, quick decline by the Ming. And so this is where the Ming story is going to change into a new dynasty, and we'll pick that up here in the next part.